Chapter 7. Della listened intently to the story that Sally told her. How this young girl could have navigated the deep woods that surrounded the cabin by herself was unbelievable. She had kept her head and had followed the flow of the water of all things. The poor girl had taken the backpack that she had left at the cabin so long ago when her parents had taken her there for a weekend. Della and Perry had tears in their eyes as they listened to Sally. She told them, when I got to the cabin, I found some of the things that I had left here. I hope you don't mind, but I took my favorite blanket and my old backpack. I wanted to have something to carry my things while I walked. I brought an apple to eat while I walked. But I saw a deer and followed him. The next thing I knew, I couldn't find the road. I found a big tree and slept under it that night. I wasn't too cold because I had my blanket. I forgot my sweater though and could have used it at night, she told them. Sally smiled as she told them, I called the office, but the lady that answered the phone couldn't help me. I didn't know what the phone number was at the house. The Wheelers were nice and Mrs. Wheeler helped me call you, Mommy. Della just held her daughter in her arms. She was in bad need of a bath, and so she smiled at her and said, I am sorry that you had to go through all that, but you are safe now. Let's go upstairs and take a bath, she told her tenderly. Sally seemed happy to go with her mommy and they walked up the stairs holding hands. Perry had to take a deep breath once more, and as he aimlessly walked around the kitchen the phone rang. It was Jim Burns. He had been charged with the murder of Larry and Steve. He needed a lawyer and Perry knew that he had to defend the man. It was going to mean a long trip back up to the town once again. But Sally was now safe and he was a lawyer. He told Larry that he would be up there within 2 hours and went upstairs to talk to Della. Della had been upstairs when she had heard the phone ring. She couldn't hear what her husband was saying, but knew by the tone of his voice that someone was once more in trouble. She helped Sally out of the bathtub and was brushing her hair when Perry came into the room. Sally watched as her mommy and daddy went out into the hall to talk and knew that something had happened. She was thinking that maybe the police had arrested or Uncle and Larry for what they had done. She was not sure. But when her mommy came in the room she was smiling. She asked her, where is Daddy going? Della knew that Sally was going to find out what had happened to the two men who had kidnapped her, but she had been hoping that she could tell her later. She picked up the brush and told her, I am sorry to have to tell you that your Uncle Steve and Larry have been murdered. We don't know who did it, but a friend of your daddy's, Jim, has been charged with the murder. Daddy is going to defend him. Sally had tears in her eyes as she thought of her uncle and the man that used to cut their grass. They were not mean to her, and she thought of her cousins. She knew what it was like to lose your parents. She looked up at her mommy and said, I want to call Aunt Mary and tell her how sorry I am. Della shook her head as she brushed the hair of the little girl that had come into her life. All of the things that she had been through, and all she wanted to do was call her aunt and cousins and told them how sorry she was for what had happened to her. She was a kind child who had a heart of gold. All right, we will go into the bedroom and call your Aunt Mary. With that the two of them went into the bedroom and Della took out her phone book. Sally went over to the bassinet and looked at her new brother. He was sleeping so peacefully. She kissed her finger and placed it on Perry's cheek. She loved her brother and was glad that he was safe and at home. As Della dialed the phone to Aunt Mary's house, she watched Sally. She loved her two children so much. As Mary got on the line, Della handed the phone over to Sally. I am so sorry about Uncle Steve. If there is anything that I can do for you, please call me. Della smiled with pride as she listened to her daughter. She sounded as though she was an adult, not like a child. The best thing about it was that what Sally was saying was what she meant. Sally really did care about her aunt and her cousins. As Mary hung up the phone, she could not believe what Sally had said. She should have taken her in. She really was a good child. Michelle Jones had been standing there with tears in her eyes. She had never deserved such a good person, and Sally really did belong with the Mason family. Perry had gone upstairs to change his clothes before he went back up to the police station and start to defend his friend Jim Burns. He looked down at his son and swore to himself that he would be safe. Even with him and Della right there in the house along with the nanny, his daughter had been kidnapped. It had been broad daylight when it had happened. As he kissed his son goodbye, he shook his head. Perry went into Sally's room and kissed her goodbye. Della followed him downstairs and kissed him passionately as he left for the police station once more. She went to go upstairs and was met by Sally. She and Sally went into the study and turned on the baby monitor. Jen was upstairs, but Della wanted an extra eye kept on the baby now. She would not feel comfortable for a while now. As she sat down to begin doing the necessary paperwork for court, she watched Sally as she colored at her own desk. Della went to work, loving her life once more. Chapter 8. Perry found himself on the way once again to help someone who was in need of a good defense attorney. He had decided many years ago that this was his life's calling and had never looked back. After years of hard work and working side by side with Della, he had fallen in love and now had a family, a home and a mortgage. With all the changes, he was a happy man. But this case was the most important case to him that he had ever worked on. Someone had murdered the two men that they knew was responsible for the kidnapping of Sally. He knew that whoever had murdered them knew a few facts. Whoever had murdered them knew that they were up at the cabin. The cabin had not been used since Sally's parents had passed away. They had to have first-hand knowledge of at least one of the men, because the cabin's location made it impossible for a passerby to see them. He was sure that whoever it was therefore had to have something to do with the kidnapping. What frightened Perry the most was that there was still a kidnapper out there. To top it off, that kidnapper was a murderer also. He feared that his family was in grave danger and wanted to get back to his home as soon as possible. Perry arrived at the local police station and found his friend Jim Burns sitting there in a cell by himself. As he spoke to him, he learned that Jim too had seen a black car on the roadway the day Sally was kidnapped. He thought that they were related to Sally's mother and father and had not noticed the license plate number. The next morning was going to be the bail hearing for Jim, and Perry and Della would be there. Perry left for home and thought about Della. He was sure that she was busy in the study working on his briefs, and as he called her, he was relieved to hear her voice. She was indeed working on the briefs for the morning. Sally had gone to bed early, as she was very tired. Perry Jr. had been a little fussy and was now sleeping quietly in his bassinet in the office with her. Perry was proud of his little family. He was now on a mission. He was going to find out who the other kidnapper was and the murderer. All he knew was that he was a man in a black car. Perry picked up his phone once again and called his friend Paul. He asked him to get right on looking into who that man was that both Jim and Sally had said that was at the cabin. Anything you and your men can find out, Paul, will be helpful. Paul had never seen his friend so upset about a case. He knew that this case was getting too personal and hoped that Perry could remain objective. He contacted a couple of his men and promised that he would be starting on his investigation right away. He looked at his watch and saw that it was now 9:30, a great time to start an investigation. As Perry arrived home, he was met by Della. He went over the work that she had done and as usual found the work without error. They put Perry Jr. into his upstairs bassinet and climbed into bed. It was already 10:30 at night and there was school for Sally in the morning if she felt up to it, and court at 10. The courthouse was almost an hour away from their home, so they would have to leave as soon as they dropped Sally off. The case that the prosecution had against Jim Burns was a weak one. They had no fingerprints of him anywhere in the home and no witnesses. Also, Perry had two people that had seen another car in the driveway that day. The charges were accepted and for once Perry's client was released from jail. But, he was subject to arrest at any other time if the police learned something, so Jim Burns was not a free man. The cabin had not been used in over a year and the dust had been everywhere. Perry wanted to find if any of the fingerprints that had been found in the cabin had been identified. There were, of course, the fingerprints of the murder victims and Sally, but there was one more set discovered. The prints belonged to an unknown person. The police had found tire tracks in the driveway. One of the tire tracks belonged to the kidnapper's car. But the other tire tracks belonged to a larger model car with 16-inch tires. It was the opinion of the police that the tracks were no more than 3 days old. That dated the tracks to the time that Sally had been there with the kidnappers. There were several beer cans left around also. Each can was brought to the lab for possible DNA. Along with that there were several cigarette butts. Perry knew that Larry did not smoke and Sally said that her uncle Steve didn't smoke either. Those went to the lab for DNA samples also. All this evidence would take months for the police to get the results and Perry was very concerned for his family's safety. He could not wait for the results of those tests. Sally was glad to be back at her home, but being at the cabin had brought back memories of her other mom and dad. She missed them very much and had taken a picture of 3 of them off of her bureau at the cabin. She wanted to put the picture up in her room, but didn't know what her new mommy and daddy would think. A tear ran down her eyes as she kissed the picture and hid it from everyone under her mattress. Someday she would tell everyone about the picture, but she didn't think that this was a good time to show the picture, not just yet. Bob Martin was now a wanted man and he knew it. He was so stupid. He had seen Sally and not thought anything about it. Steve was the little girl's uncle. He was a jerk sometimes, but he didn't think anything of her. Steve and Larry had told him that Michelle was coming up and they were going to have a little family get-together. The guy owed him over $500 and he had wanted the money. They had argued at the cabin and he was sure that Sally heard them. Now the 2 men were dead. He had nothing to do with that, but he knew that he was probably going to jail anyways. He couldn't afford an expensive lawyer like Jim Burns had gotten. What to do, he thought. Chapter 9. As the day went by, guilt haunted the man that was known as Bob Martin. He was in full protect mode. The best way to keep my freedom is to find out who the murderer is. He knew that he was on borrowed time, because the police were looking for his car. There were never very many people up by the cabin. It was in a very remote place and that is why the 2 idiots had brought Sally there. He thought and thought about what the men had said to him. Larry was very nervous and when Sally had come into the room he had panicked. If he hadn't been such a nervous wreck, Sally might not have thought anything of him. But, because of the way Larry acted and Steve had put her back in the bedroom, he was sure that Sally would remember him. Bob had asked them what Sally was doing there. They had said that Steve's children were coming up there to spend some time in the woods with her cousins. They had not been there yet, but were due to come that afternoon. His cabin was just down the road about 5 miles away from the cabin where Sally had been kept. There was little or no traffic on the road and it seemed to him that perhaps his wife might have seen someone on the road that day. As Bob went into the house he was worried and his wife Donna could see the worry on his face. "Bob, what is wrong? You have been a nervous wreck for the past week. Does it have anything to do with the kidnapping of the little girl? Come on, you need to tell me. I will not tell anyone about what you tell me and they can't force me to testify against you," she nearly begged him. Bob was now a very worried man and he knew that Donna would stand by him. He went into the refrigerator not wanting anything, but wanted her not to see his face. They had been married too long and she knew his thoughts. "I was wondering if you saw a car on the road the day that they found those 2 men murdered," he asked her. "I was not feeling well that day, remember? I was sleeping in the back of the house and didn't hear or see anything." "What about you?" she asked him. Bob shook his head and said, "No, I saw no one and I certainly didn't see that poor little girl out in the woods. I can't imagine that she was out in the woods overnight. It is truly a miracle that she was all right." He cleared his throat and told her, "I am the man, though, that the police are looking for. I am such an idiot. I saw Sally at the cabin the day before. Steve told me that she was up here to have a visit with her cousins. Sally came into the room and looked fine. I didn't know they had kidnapped her, he pleaded to his wife. Donna couldn't believe what her husband had just said. He had seen Sally and not known about the kidnapping. Their home had no television and neither one of them went into town very often. They had not heard about the kidnapping until after the murder. Their son had heard about it when he had gone into town. Barry Martin was just 19 and was on his way back up to his house when he thought about the black car that the police were looking for. He had a feeling that the police were looking for the family car. What he wanted to know was who was the lady that had been driving the Chevrolet Impala that day. He had seen a lady going up the road that morning. He had not seen her come back down the mountain, though. As he came into the driveway, he thought that he would speak to his mom and dad about what he had seen. Donna and her husband had heard their son Barry come into the driveway and were sitting at the front window to the small cabin as he came in. That was when Barry told them about the wild Impala that he had seen on that morning. They were talking about what they had seen when there was a knock on the front door. Bob looked out the window and saw a tall man with gray hair standing at the front door. He did not look like a police officer. It was a rare occasion, when they had visitors. He opened the door and found himself face to face with Paul Drake. Paul introduced himself to the people in the cabin and Bob looked at his family. He needed to tell someone what he knew. It certainly had not been their friend who had murdered the two kidnappers. So he asked Paul to take a seat. "Paul, we moved here years ago for our privacy. But Sally and her family had come here many weeks out of the year. They were very nice people and we were devastated when they were killed in the accident. Many hours I work in the woods and saw a car in the cabin driveway. It had caught me by surprise, because I had not heard it drive by. As I came to the door to find out who was there, I was met by Steve. I knew Steve, and when he said that he and his friend had come up to the cabin for a family get-together, I had no reason to think anything of it. I saw Sally and she said nothing to me. She did not look scared. She took a video game and went back to her room." Paul had wondered about the black car that had been seen. He had actually stopped by the house because of the black car in the driveway. "Is there anything else that you heard or saw?" he asked. That was when Barry spoke up. "I saw a woman go by in a white Chevy Impala. She was driving up the road the morning that the men were murdered." Paul was now very interested in what he was hearing. "Did you get a good look at her?" Barry nodded and told him yes, pretty good. "I would know her if I saw her again," he told her. Paul then took out some pictures. "There," the young man said. "Yes, this is her." That was when Paul knew who the murderer was. Now he needed to prove it. He thanked the Martins and went out to his car and called Perry. Chapter 10. The one thing that Perry Mason and Paul Drake had always been very good at was getting a mystery solved. This was a tough case as it had involved Sally, the daughter of Perry. Now that Paul had the driver of the Chevrolet Impala identified, he went to the local police. As he arrived at the police station, he found the chief seated behind the desk. The town was a small one and his force, that consisted of just 3 men, were doing their best to investigate the murder. Paul Drake and any experience that he had was welcomed by the man. As Paul spoke to the police chief, the man listened intently. The tire tracks that had been left in the driveway were from a large car and could have come from a Chevrolet Impala indeed. Now that Barry Martin had come and told him his story and how he had seen the lady drive the Chevrolet Impala past their cabin, his word was good with him. An arrest warrant was put out for Sally's Aunt Mary. They had proof that she was at the cabin, and she had the time to commit the murder. As they went to her home and placed her under arrest, she called her Aunt Michelle to take her children for at least the night. She had no attorney, and so an attorney was appointed for her by the court. Mary had been getting dinner ready when she had heard a knock on the kitchen door. The police caught her completely by surprise. She had nothing to do with Steve's murder and was getting ready for the funeral in the morning. Now she would be in court while her two boys were attending their father's funeral. Things just couldn't have gone wrong. Mary was allowed to make a phone call as she had two small children alone in the house. The only person that Mary could think of calling was her Aunt Michelle. Michelle had been through this herself and knew that at best Mary was in a desperate situation. This piece of news also caught Michelle Jones completely by surprise. Michelle knew that with a court-appointed attorney she would not get the best defense that was possible. She had Perry Mason, and because of that she was now a free woman. She needed to go to Mr. Mason and plead for him to take Mary's defense. Mary did not have much money, but she was now a widow with two small children to care for. They had lost their stepfather and now were in danger of losing their mother also. She would plead her case to Mr. Mason. As Michelle called to Mr. Mason's office, she made an appointment for that afternoon. As she had feared, Mary had not been given a chance to post a bond. She was going to be held over until her trial. The poor woman was not going to be able to attend her own husband's funeral, and her two sons were now living with her. Mary had been thinking and thinking about what the prosecution had said. They had the case all sewn up tight, or so it looked to her. She was in a real bind, and the court-appointed attorney had said hardly anything in her defense. He was a very young man and admitted to her that this was his first murder case. Della was still out on maternity leave for the most part. Perry Jr. was just 2 weeks old and she still was very tired. She did not mind going to court with her husband, but the time at the office was much tougher on her. She could easily work from home instead and took advantage of the study at her house. Della found that from her study she could do almost everything except meet with clients. She would be working from home for a while. Michelle Jones had come to see Perry Mason to ask or beg him to help Mary. Mary was being railroaded. She was a gentle person and would not kill anyone, of that Michelle was sure. Perry asked Michelle Jones to take a seat once more in his office. The lady that sat next to him was a woman named Gertie. She was very different from Della and a little less serious. Mr. Mason was a kind man and she knew that he wanted justice for everyone. It was now time for her to make her pitch. After Michelle took a seat, she spoke right up. "Mr. Mason, you have been very good to me and my family. You are a wonderful dad to Sally, and thanks to you she is a happy little girl. But, right now her Aunt Mary is in a bind. She couldn't hurt a fly. She has been framed for the murder of her husband and Larry. They have given her an attorney through the court and the young lad has never even tried a case before." Perry Mason had indeed dedicated his life to helping the innocent. But, this case had him wound up tighter than he had ever been. The two murdered men had kidnapped his daughter and he was having trouble with not getting involved. If you could not take a case objectively, a lawyer should never accept it. That had always been his thoughts. He had followed those rules since he had first passed the bar and didn't think that this was a good time to change the rules. Not only was he involved with Michelle and Mary, but Sally was still traumatized by what had happened. He thought and thought about what he should do. "I will tell you what, Michelle. This case has been very hard on me physically as well as mentally. But, you are right, Mary does deserve the best defense. I will call her lawyer and offer to help him with the case. The first thing that we need to do is to get Mary out on bond." Perry shook her hand and told Gertie to go get Paul. "Then find out the number to Mr. Davis's office. I want to call that young lawyer." Chapter 11. Attorney Davis was just out of law school. He had been one of the top members of his class, but had decided to dedicate his work to the less fortunate and the poor of the city. He knew that he would never be as financially set as many of his other colleagues, but he thought that there would be a deep satisfaction with what he could accomplish. This Lady Mary had him very worried. He had studied capital murder cases in law school, of course, but this lady was facing a real long prison term if he could not help her. There were things that just did not add up to her being the real murderer. But, he had failed her when he had asked for bond. Because of his inexperience, the prosecutor had walked all over him, and Mary had missed her own husband's funeral. This was unacceptable, and Larry Davis had made up his mind then and there that he was going to get her acquitted. It was late and he was at his desk going over law after law when his phone had rung. He was surprised that it rang so late at night. He had not gotten very many calls since he had opened his office. In fact, of the 10 calls that he had received, 2 had been a wrong number. As he answered the phone, he was shocked to hear the voice of Perry Mason on the other end of the line. Mr. Mason had taught a few classes at his school when he had attended, and he had a very distinguished voice. Mr. Mason was offering to help him with the case against Mary. Larry had read the whole story. The 2 men had kidnapped the little girl that Perry Mason and his wife had just adopted. The men were found murdered in the cabin where they had kept the little girl captive. Perry Mason was asking him if he could come over to the office and talk about the case. "I would be honored to have you assist me on any case. I am here at my office now." Perry smiled as he hung up the phone. Attorney Davis was an eager man and would wait for him to come. This was a sign that he had the ability to be a good lawyer one day. He thought of his first few days. There he sat in an office with all these books and the desire to change the world, and no one called. He had sat there in his office with no one but his mother there to keep him company for weeks. But then he had hired Della and the cases started come in. That was a long time ago, and now he was married with a family and very happy with his life. As Perry hit the button that would take him up to Attorney Davis' office, he thought of the young man who had asked so many questions as a student at one of his lectures. Larry had been a bright student and Perry had liked him right there on the spot. Larry Davis met Perry at his office door and the 2 men sat down for a long discussion. Perry looked around at the office and saw what a shambles it was in. There were papers and books everywhere. It looked to him like Larry needed someone like his Della to take care of the office. "I have heard that you have taken the case of the woman who has been charged in the murders of the 2 men who kidnapped my daughter. I was wondering if you have any plans on how you want to defend her." Larry looked into the man's eyes and knew that he could somehow tell what Larry was thinking even if he had said nothing. "I have not been able to build up much of a defense, but I do have some serious questions about the police take on the murder. That is where I plan to start," Larry told Perry. "What kind of problems do you see with this case?" Perry asked him intently. "Is this discussion going to be just between you and me and confidential?" Larry asked him. "Yes, this discussion will go no further than this room if that is the way you want it to be," Perry promised him. Larry took a seat behind his desk and said, "I would like to look more into this man that says he saw Mary driving her car up to the cabin. In one statement he needs to see a picture of her to identify her. Yet my client says that she has known him and Mary's own family since he was a young child. He should have said that is Mary, and that should have been the end of it. When I talked to the man at the local gas station today, he said that he hadn't seen Mary in the town since his friend Nora and her husband had been killed in the accident." Larry studied the man's eyes and could see that Mr. Mason was thinking about what had just been said. "Who told you that Larry knew Mary?" Perry asked Larry. "Bob Martin, his father, told me that the 2 families had been friends for years. Once in a while their son Barry would watch Sally for a short time. They used to go up there for barbecue and things," Larry told them. "Larry, this case has been one of the hardest case that I have ever worked on. My first rule has always been don't get involved. But when these 2 men, Larry and Steve, kidnapped my daughter, I became emotionally involved and should have stepped down. You are right, and I no longer think that Mary is guilty of doing anything. I have a man named Paul Drake up by the cabin right now. I think that he should look into Barry Martin and who he has been hanging around with. I don't think that he is telling the truth about who he saw driving up to the cabin that day." Perry watched as the young man tried to take everything in. "So you think that Mary is innocent? Will you help me find out who the real murderer is?" Larry asked him. "Yes, Larry, I can help you. But, this is still your case. I will just assist you with it. I am too involved." Please come to my office first thing in the morning and we will begin the process of having another hearing. As Perry left the office that evening, he knew that he had not done the best he could. He should have realized by himself that Mary was not the murderer. She was at a PTA meeting that night at 7 and had worked until a few minutes after 5. The ride was an hour each way from LA to the cabin, and at first she had been ruled out as a suspect. Now once more Perry needed to once more find the real murderer. Chapter 12. Larry Davis was sitting at his office going over and over the evidence. He knew that his client was guilty of nothing but being married to a kidnapper. She loved the little girl Sally and was sad that she had not been able to take her in when her parents had died. She had told him how her husband Steve had put his foot down. "I took in your 2 boys and agreed to help raise them when we got married. I am not going to take a little girl in now. It is too much for me. I want children of my own," he had told her. But then who would have had the motive and the reason to kill the 2 men? He just knew that they were missing something. This Martin boy, he was the key to the puzzle, of that he was now positive. It was time for him to go up to the town himself. He thought of going up there in the morning, but decided to go up to the town right then and there. He went out to his car and headed out to the town where the murder had happened. When Perry Mason got home, everything was quiet. As he went to bedroom, Della was awake reading. She knew that something was not right with the case. They were too close to everything. Mary was not the murderer. She had no reason to kill her husband or the gardener. Della looked at her husband and said, "Mary is innocent, isn't she?" Perry kissed his wife on the forehead and said, "Yes. There is only one person that could be the murderer. I am working with Larry Davis, and in the morning we are applying for another court hearing. We will need to get subpoenas out, and from the suspects, we will find the murder. I promise you." Larry Davis arrived in town just about midnight and headed to the local bar. There he met with the bartender. Everyone in the bar was talking about the murder and the 2 men. That was when Larry heard the 2 men talking about Larry Burns and his wife. It seems that his wife was well known at the bar. She was seen with Barry Martin quite frequently. This was the type of thing that Larry Davis enjoyed learning. He sat at the bar and listened intently to the talk, but heard nothing more that was very interesting. Everyone felt sorry for the daughter of Nora and Bob. They were such a good family. He heard that over and over and thought of the little girl. Now, he wanted to find out more about Larry Burns' wife. She was a suspect, certainly. Did she have the time to commit the murder? But Sally said it was a man's voice that she heard. Also, Sally did not know the man. She would have known Barry Martin certainly. It had to be someone that Sally didn't recognize. This person was the murderer. This presented a problem for Larry and Perry. Both men knew that there had been a man at the cabin that Sally did not know. This man was arguing with Steve and Larry. It was not Jim Burns or Barry Martin. Sally knew both men. So who could it be? Meanwhile, Paul Drake had been thinking over and over who could have been the man that Sally had seen at the cabin that day. The only way for them to find out was to ask Sally. She might be able to identify the man from a photo. It hit Paul like a bolt of lightning. He thought of the time several months ago when Larry had not been able to do the Mason's lawn that day. Cameron Daly had come by the house. He was Larry's boss. He had done the yard that day. Sally had been at her Aunt Michelle's for the weekend and had not seen him. He was driving a black car. He needed to find out who was driving the white Chevrolet. Now Paul had two people that he had to really look a little harder into. He wanted to find out about the white Chevrolet and the man named Cameron Daly. He thought for a moment and gave Perry a call. Perry was up and answered the phone right away. "You keep looking, Paul. You are right about that man Cameron. Sally would not have known him. Get a picture of him and I will show it to you." Meanwhile, Larry Davis decided that he was going to go up to the cabin and see if he could see anything. It was very late and he was tired. As he pulled into the driveway of the house, he could see that someone was in the house. He knocked on the door and was met by a gun. He did not know the man that was standing at the door, but the man knew him. "Well, Mr. Davis, you had to stick your nose into something that you had no business getting into. I am going to have to do something with you." With that, he forced Larry to get into the trunk of the car. The man tied his hands and feet and shut the trunk lid. As the car went down the long hill, Larry was working very hard to get loose from the ties. He found a box cutter of all things in the trunk and worked on his hands feverishly. He was still working on the ropes when the car stopped. As the man opened the trunk lid, Larry kicked him with every bit of strength that he could muster. He yanked as hard as he could and the ties to his hands released. With the lightning speed of the college boxing champ, the man was down. Larry called the police and reported the kidnapping. The police came and were surprised to find the man that had been caught was the same man who had been in town a few weeks ago. He had been looking into purchasing some property. His name was Cameron Daly. Chapter 13. Perry Mason had just gotten to this office when he got a call from Larry Davis. He told him what had happened. Perry Mason was wondering who this man Cameron Daly was. "I am going to contact Paul Drake and have him look into this man immediately. In the meantime, you and I need to go to court. I want all of the suspects at court for a hearing." Larry Davis agreed completely with Mr. Mason and willingly agreed to meet him at the courthouse in 2 hours. He was tired and need to change his clothes before appearing in court. But other than that, he was all right. The meeting with that horrible man Cameron Daly had been very unnerving and he was glad to get back to Los Angeles. The two attorneys filed the necessary papers and spoke to the judge about another hearing. The hearing was granted for 2 days from then. They informed the judge about the kidnapping of Larry and applied for the man to be held until the court date. With this done, the two men went to work with finding out who the murderer was. Cameron Daly was sitting in the jail cell in town. He was held on the count of kidnapping. What on earth was I doing kidnapping the lawyer? This had gotten way out of hand. He wasn't going to take the charge of murder for anyone either. What to do, he thought over and over. Paul Drake had been busy himself working on the case. There were so many twists and turns that he was sure he too was missing something. Cameron Daly had gotten into trouble with the law a couple of times. But nothing had ever been a major charge. He was sure that Cameron was the man that Sally had seen, though. There was something else missing. There was still the problem of the lady in the white Impala that had been seen. He needed to take a look at Sally's family. Pow had only a day to find out all that he could. He went to Michelle Jones' house and asked her about anyone that she might know who drove a white Chevy Impala. She did not. As he was sitting in the living room, Brian Capron, the young man who had taken care of Sally for a while, came in. Paul asked him and looked to see that he was driving a blue Toyota. Neither one of them said they knew anything. They both were very concerned about the case and worried that someone was still out there that might try to kidnap Sally again. Paul then went over to talk to Mary once again. As Mary came out to meet him, she looked as though she had aged 5 years. She was tired and he could see that she had not had much sleep. "Have you thought of anything that could help your case? Do you know anyone that owns a white Impala?" Paul asked her. Mary had spent the whole time that she was in jail racking her brains on who owned a white Chevy. She had gone over the days of the kidnapping and the murder over and over and had no answers. "I have done nothing but think of that ever since they arrested me. I do not know of anyone that drives a car like that. I am sorry." But thank you for helping Attorney Davis. He is a good man but so young, and the prosecutor just was walking all over him, she told him with hope in her voice. Meanwhile, Perry Mason had been thinking of nothing but the case. As he went and got Sally from school, he wanted to show her the picture of Cameron Daly. If she recognized Larry Davis was about to give his speech, and he found that his throat was so dry that he could barely speak. He looked at his friend and aide Perry Mason and took a deep breath. He was probably one of the luckiest lawyers on the good earth. He had Mr. Mason there to help him with any question. He took a sip of water and stood up. Here he presented to the jury his thoughts on the murder. I can promise you that beyond a doubt my client is not guilty of doing anything. She was not anywhere near the scene of the murder. As a matter of fact, she was busy at a PTA meeting at her son's school. She worked until 5 that day and then picked the boys up from their babysitter. She then went home and made them supper. The cabin where the murder took place was an hour away and the meeting was at 7 that night. That would not give her the time to commit the crime. Also, we are going to have testimony given that she was seen driving up the mountain to the cabin. The girl that was kidnapped saw only 4 men while she was there and never saw any women. We will prove that someone else is guilty of this crime. He hoped that he would be able to convince the jury of what he believed to be true in his heart of hearts and took a seat. The prosecution called their first witness. This was the state trooper who had come to the scene to examine the evidence. As he told the jury of his findings, Larry could not find anything to argue. Perry touched his arm and said it's all right with that. Larry said no questions. Mary was getting nervous when her attorney did not challenge the findings of the police or the coroner. But she could see that Perry Mason was keeping a careful eye on the proceedings and was being of a tremendous help to Attorney Davis. But this was her life and she wanted to be a free woman. One of the things that Perry had not looked forward to was putting Sally on the witness stand. He felt that she had been through enough already. He thought of his little girl and how she had sat at the kitchen table eating her Cheerios when he had come over to talk to her. Sally, I have to ask you a couple of questions. They can be tough, but there are a few things that you need to know, he had told her tenderly. What is it, Daddy? Does this have something to do with the murder trial and my Aunt Mary? Sally had asked with her big eyes. Perry had adopted Sally hoping to protect her from this kind of thing. Sally had a rough life after her parents had been killed in the car accident and he had wanted to protect her. But, somehow or another, fate had taken over and she had been kidnapped. He smiled at her and said, Sally, the man that is defending your Aunt Mary, Attorney Davis, would like to talk to you in the courtroom. Sally put down her spoon and stared at her father. You mean they want me to tell the court what I saw? She asked. Yes, that is it exactly. They would like you to speak to the judge and a jury about what you saw and heard when you were at the cabin. It is very important that you answer each of their questions and you tell the truth, he told her gently. Della had walked into the kitchen holding the baby when she heard what Perry was telling Sally. She smiled at the little girl. She was so mature for a little girl and listened as Sally told Perry, Dad, I know that you are supposed to tell the truth all the time, but especially in court. I will be all right. Don't worry. And with this, Sally gave her daddy a big hug. Perry had to turn his head for a second to hide the tears that were welling up in his eyes. Sally was a truly good little girl. He had picked up his son and smiled at him. He was one lucky little boy to have a big sister like Sally. Sally was to testify that afternoon. The courtroom was going to be empty of everyone but the lawyers, the judge, the jury, and Perry and Della. The judge and prosecution had both agreed to those terms. Della had picked Sally up from school and headed straight to court. As Sally took the oath to tell the truth, she held her hand up and took her seat carefully. She was so little that the microphone barely reached her. But she was told to tell the truth and speak loudly and clearly, and that was what she planned on doing. The judge told the jury that they could ask any questions that they might have, but to remember that this was a 9-year-old child. The prosecutor had children of his own, and although he was not Hamilton Berger, the man that Perry was used to dealing with, he was a kind and considerate man. Sally was a trooper when she was on the stand telling every detail of her kidnapping. As she described the time in the woods alone, Larry and Perry could see that the jury was feeling every moment along with her. But she did not provide any new information for her aunt, and Perry had to prove who the real murderer was. Sally was told that she could get down, and she turned around and thanked the judge. As she walked down the aisle, Della took her hand. The judge noted the time and said that court would reconvene at 10 a.m. the following morning. Just as the three Mason family members started to leave the courtroom, Paul came in and motioned to Perry that he needed to talk to him. As Perry excused himself from Della and Sally, he went over to Paul. Paul said, "I think that tomorrow we should start with some testimony from Brian and his new girlfriend Carrie. When I went there to drop off the subpoena, she nearly fainted. She wouldn't say a word, but something isn't right there, Perry." With that, the two men walked out of the courthouse once
Chapter
again
16.
together. Larry Davis was about to give his speech, and he found that his throat was so dry that he could barely speak. He looked at his friend and aide Perry Mason and took a deep breath. He was probably one of the luckiest lawyers on the good earth. He had Mr. Mason there to help him with any question. He took a sip of water and stood up. Here he presented to the jury his thoughts on the murder. "I can promise you that beyond a doubt my client is not guilty of doing anything. She was not anywhere near the scene of the murder. As a matter of fact, she was busy at a PTA meeting at her son's school. She worked until 5 that day and then picked the boys up from their babysitter. She then went home and made them supper. The cabin where the murder took place was an hour away, and the meeting was at 7 that night. That would not give her the time to commit the crime. Also, we are going to have testimony given that she was seen driving up the mountain to the cabin. The girl that was kidnapped saw only 4 men while she was there and never saw any women. We will prove that someone else is guilty of this crime." He hoped that he would be able to convince the jury of what he believed to be true in his heart of hearts, and took a seat. The prosecution called their first witness. This was the state trooper who had come to the scene to examine the evidence. As he told the jury of his findings, Larry could not find anything to argue. Perry touched his arm and said, "It's all right with that." Larry said, "No questions." Mary was getting nervous when her attorney did not challenge the findings of the police or the coroner. But she could see that Perry Mason was keeping a careful eye on the proceedings and was being of a tremendous help to Attorney Davis. But this was her life, and she wanted to be a free woman. One of the things that Perry had not looked forward to was putting Sally on the witness stand. He felt that she had been through enough already. He thought of his little girl and how she had sat at the kitchen table eating her Cheerios when he had come over to talk to her. "Sally, I have to ask you a couple of questions. They can be tough, but there are a few things that you need to know," he had told her tenderly. "What is it, Daddy? Does this have something to do with the murder trial and my Aunt Mary?" Sally had asked with her big eyes. Perry had adopted Sally hoping to protect her from this kind of thing. Sally had a rough life after her parents had been killed in the car accident, and he had wanted to protect her. But, somehow or another, fate had taken over and she had been kidnapped. He smiled at her and said, "Sally, the man that is defending your Aunt Mary, Attorney Davis, would like to talk to you in the courtroom." Sally put down her spoon and stared at her father. "You mean they want me to tell the court what I saw?" she asked. "Yes, that is it exactly. They would like you to speak to the judge and a jury about what you saw and heard when you were at the cabin. It is very important that you answer each of their questions and you tell the truth," he told her gently. Della had walked into the kitchen holding the baby when she heard what Perry was telling Sally. She smiled at the little girl. She was so mature for a little girl and listened as Sally told Perry, "Dad, I know that you are supposed to tell the truth all the time, but especially in court. I will be all right. Don't worry." And with this, Sally gave her daddy a big hug. Perry had to turn his head for a second to hide the tears that were welling up in his eyes. Sally was a truly good little girl. He had picked up his son and smiled at him. He was one lucky little boy to have a big sister like Sally. Sally was to testify that afternoon. The courtroom was going to be empty of everyone but the lawyers, the judge, the jury, and Perry and Della. The judge and prosecution had both agreed to those terms. Della had picked Sally up from school and headed straight to court. As Sally took the oath to tell the truth, she held her hand up and took her seat carefully. She was so little that the microphone barely reached her. But she was told to tell the truth and speak loudly and clearly, and that was what she planned on doing. The judge told the jury that they could ask any questions that they might have, but to remember that this was a 9-year-old child. The prosecutor had children of his own, and although he was not Hamilton Berger, the man that Perry was used to dealing with, he was a kind and considerate man. Sally was a trooper when she was on the stand telling every detail of her kidnapping. As she described the time in the woods alone, Larry and Perry could see that the jury was feeling every moment along with her. But she did not provide any new information for her aunt, and Perry had to prove who the real murderer was. Sally was told that she could get down, and she turned around and thanked the judge. As she walked down the aisle, Della took her hand. The judge noted the time and said that court would reconvene at 10 a.m. the following morning. Just as the three Mason family members started to leave the courtroom, Paul came in and motioned to Perry that he needed to talk to him. As Perry excused himself from Della and Sally, he went over to Paul. Paul said, "I think that tomorrow we should start with some testimony from Brian and his new girlfriend Carrie. When I went there to drop off the subpoena, she nearly fainted. She wouldn't say a word, but something isn't right there, Perry." With that, the two men walked out of the courthouse. Chapter 18. That evening the lights burned bright at the Davis office once more. Larry was sure that the case would be closed by the end of the day tomorrow. He had been waiting for one of those moments that Perry Mason had been famous for, but it hadn't happened. He went over the testimony of each witness over and over, but still had no answer. Perry Mason was not used to being the secondary lawyer. There had been so many times that he had wanted to jump up and object, but Larry Davis was indeed a good attorney. He had handled himself well. For a lawyer on his first big case, he was holding his own. "Perhaps it is time for me to consider taking in a partner," he thought to himself. Meanwhile, Mary, Sally's aunt, was very worried about what was going to happen to her. She didn't see where Perry Mason or Larry Davis were learning anything new on her case. The prosecution was making it sound as if she was the murderer. She had watched the jury, and the looks that they were giving her were not good ones. Some of them seemed to glare at her as they listened to the testimony. It was the morning again, and the courtroom was full. Della was helping Amy with all of the papers, while Perry was helping Larry with the presentations that he was going to present that day. There were a lot of papers to go through, and although Larry had practiced in front of a mirror the night before, he was still nervous about how court was going to go that day. He took one more look in the mirror and straightened his tie before going back into the courtroom once again. Mary looked around the room and got a smiling nod from Della. Della had been her steadfast friend throughout the whole terrible ordeal. Mary thought of what a wonderful person Della was. She wondered what Della thought about her. Here she was, a mother who had married a man who kidnapped his wife's niece for money and then been murdered. She was sure that Della knew that she had not murdered anyone, but she wasn't sure of what the thought of her as a person. But the court was ready to start, and as Mary and the rest of the courtroom stood up as the judge entered the room, Mary took another deep breath. The trial for her life was about to begin once again. The next person that was called was Brain Capron. He looked very young and nervous as he took the stand and swore to tell the truth and the whole truth. When it was finally Larry's turn to question the man, Larry was ready. At this point he did not think that Brian was the murderer, but he wanted to know what he had seen and heard that day. He also wanted to know what he was doing up at the cabin. Larry walked up to the witness stand and looked Brian right in the face. "Did you go to the cabin the day of the murder?" he asked. "Yes, I was there," he told Attorney Davis nervously. "What did you see?" Davis demanded. "I saw nothing, there was no one there. I went in using the key that was under the doormat, but no one was there," Brian told him. "Did you wait there?" Davis asked. "I waited for over 2 hours and no one came. I figured that no one was there," Brian told him. "But there must have been signs that someone had been there." "What did you see?" "I knew that someone had been there because there were games in the living room that had been played recently. One of the games were brand new and just came out a few weeks ago," Brian told him. "Did you think that Sally was there?" Larry asked him. "That is why I went up there. Something that Steve had said got me thinking. So I followed him. I lost them about 10 miles from the town. But I was sure that was where they were heading," Brian told them. "Are you sure that you never saw them again?" Larry asked him. "Yes, I am sure. I went home and never saw either one of them again." "What did Steve say that made you think that he might be involved in the kidnapping?" Larry asked. "I was behind the garage getting something when I heard Steve on the phone. He was saying that the money would be paid soon and don't worry about it. He called the man on the phone that he was taking to Ken or Cam, I am not sure. That was when Larry and Perry knew who the real murderer was." As Cameron Daly started to get up and leave the courtroom, the bailiff stopped him. Larry turned and thanked Brian and then said, "I would like to call Mr. Cameron Daly to the stand." Cameron took the stand with an attitude. He was not going to tell them anything. But Larry was persistent, and as the young attorney was now on attack mode, he asked him, "Did you know about the kidnapping?" "No, how would I know about that?" Cameron spit back. "We have a witness that says that you were seen at the cabin. We know that you knew about the ransom money, and we also know that you drive a black car that was seen in the area," Larry demanded. Cameron Daly knew that he was finished. "All right, I admit that I killed them. I went up to the cabin to see how things were going on, and the two morons had lost Sally. They had no idea where she was. I did not want her dead or injured. But the two of them had no idea where she was, and they wanted to keep more of the money. They were going to turn me in as a kidnapper if Sally was found safe. I had to kill them." With that, Mary found herself a free woman once again. Perry was now free from worry. He now knew the truth and his family was safe. As they all shook hands and hugged each other, Perry thought about the man that could be his partner.